Hi, David. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thanks, Alan. Great to be here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I've been, I started reading your books years ago. With James Patterson was one of the first books I read from yours, and so it was
Oh,
my introduction to you.
sure, yeah. A lot of people know me that way.
Yeah, that's gotta be that must be kind of wild. I mean, you've been a judge, you're all these incredible careers that you've had, but then to team up with the juggernaut like James Patterson, how did that came to be? Was it scary
Yeah.
at first?
Yeah, no, yes, it was scary. Not because he made it scary. I think I did that to myself. So the long and short of it, if you want the background, is when I came out with my first book, which was basically like in 99, right? Like it was a while ago, a book called Line of Vision. I was a nobody, right? So I sent my book around like you did back then. And today you still do it. You send it to bigger authors to see if they'll say something nice about it and give you a little blurb, right? So among the many authors we sent it around to was James Patterson. Even back then, he was one of the biggest authors in the world. And so he really liked the book, like he really liked it, and wrote a really nice blurb. And I was really grateful, wrote him a little thank you note. And when I went around to the bookstores in Manhattan, which back then, Alan, just to give you an idea how much times have changed, there were four mystery only bookstores just in New York City, just in Manhattan. Now you'd struggle to find four in the whole country, brick and mortar stores. There were four just in Manhattan, and you went around each of them and you signed all the books they had. And everywhere I went, they said, "Oh, you'll never believe who was just here talking about you, James Patterson." And so that was really nice for a guy who was unknown, right? And so fast forward to the year 2007, right? And now I'm switching literary agents. And the guy who I hired was a guy who had been running Warner Books. He was the head publisher, the top guy at Warner Books, which has a bunch of imprints under it, including Little Brown, which is where Patterson writes. So he knew Patterson, of course, extremely well. They were friends. They would have lunch. So my new agent was having lunch with Jim and they were talking and he said, "Tell me about your new job as a literary agent. You've switched sides. Who are your clients?" He mentioned me and 7, 8 years later, Jim was like, "I know Dave Ellis. He wrote Line of Vision, which was my first book." And he said, "I really liked it." And he started going off about all the things he liked about it. Because that's how Jim works. He's got that kind of a mind. He could do that today if you pressed him. What did you like about Dave Ellis's book, his first book written, 25 years ago? And he would tell you exactly what I did right and what I did wrong, by the way. Um, so he said Jim was starting to have co-authors at the time, and they said, "Hey, what about Dave being one of them?" And he said, "I'm game." And so my agent and I were having dinner in New York, and he said, "What do you think? Do you want to write with James Patterson?" And believe it or not, Alan, I was reluctant. And I think you kind of touched on it. The reason, I kind of was like, well, I'm not sure we write exactly the same. I'm not sure that would work. But I think really I was just nervous. I was just like, I don't want to blow something like that. So he said, "I'll tell you what, call him, call Jim and talk to him. And then if you don't want to do it, don't do it. But I think you will." And so I called him and he was the nicest guy, right? He's just the most down to earth guy you'll ever meet. And he immediately started telling me everything he liked about Line of Vision, this book I wrote. At that time, it was 7 years ago. And I said, "Jim, look, I'm incredibly flattered that you would think of me. I'd love to do it, but I'm not sure I know how to write a James Patterson book." And he said the coolest thing to me, Alan. He said, "I don't want you to write a James Patterson book. I want you to write a James Patterson, David Ellis book. I want you to combine your skills. I know your skill set. I know what you're capable of. And I know what I can do. And I think if we put our minds together and collaborate, we can do something really cool and fresh." And so I thought, how do you say no to that? And I've been working with him ever since, still am. And I don't think there's been a single day where he treated me like he was the boss and I was the employee. Like he is the boss, but he doesn't talk to you that way. I mean, I've had a lot of editors as a solo novelist, right? I deal with people at publishing houses. But here, my editor is a best-selling author, the best-selling author probably in the world, who has forgotten more about book writing than I'll ever know. So every time I talk to the guy, it's like I'm taking a master class. He has a master class. You can find it on, social media. I take that every time I talk to him, which is every couple of weeks. And so this day, I mean, I've been writing with him. I think our first book came out in 2009, I think. I'm still learning from the guy. Like you know, he'll be first one to tell you proudly, humbly, we're not writing Pulitzer Prize winning books. He said, I'm not here to do that. I could maybe try to do that, but I'm not telling my readers that's what they're going to get. When I'm telling my readers, what I'm promising them for the kind of genre that I write with him on, because he has different genres. He said, for my genre, it's going to be fun, fast paced, entertaining, never boring, and you know, surprising, fun. And he keeps that promise, and he keeps me to that promise. And sometimes you can get caught up as a writer, Alan. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. You can get caught up in writing something really perfectly, you know, getting every word just right and being really proud of it. But if it doesn't advance the story, or if it slows down the pace, he'll say, I always know I'm in trouble when he says, this is really good writing. But then he'll say, and the but is a little long. You know, we're slowing the pace down. Let's keep it going. He'll always say it very nicely, but he's always making sure he's very particular about how every chapter should read. And it should never be boring, should always have something centrally very interesting about it. No slow chapters, no boring chapters. And you know, Alan, that sounds easy to say, right? Like you step back and you say, well, of course, Dave, of course, every chapter, who would want to write a boring chapter? But the truth is, when you're writing a plot intensive mystery or thriller, you're going to have some chapters that are slower,
Mhm.
usually at least. You're stepping little stepping stones to the big islands that are the big moments. He doesn't believe in little stepping stones. He's like, keep everything interesting and fun. And maybe not every chapter is going to be surprising, but then do something else in that chapter that makes the reader feel rewarded. Keep it short, keep it tight, keep, you know, short attention span world we live in, right? Nice, crisp chapters, which I obviously do myself now, almost exclusively. And, you know, it sounds easy. It's incredibly hard. He's quite possibly the smartest human being I've ever met in my life. And he just writes fun thrillers, right? It's not rocket science. We're not curing cancer. But again, he knows the pact he's made with the reader, and he's going to keep that pact.
Yeah, you mentioned his masterclass. I've actually uh, bought that on that masterclass site, and I've watched it several times, and it's it's like the best one out there for writers. So FYI for writers listening to this, and he even like provided you one of his outlines for his one of his actual books, like the PDF. He's here you go. I'm like, wow. So like you could actually see an outline that from James Patterson is so just like a real giving guy.
Yeah, no, he really is. He really is generous and giving, and he has no pride of authorship. There will be times when we write, doesn't happen often, but sometimes I'll pop an idea up halfway through the book and say, hey, instead of doing this, why don't we do this? And he'll never say no just because it wasn't his idea. He doesn't care whose idea it is. That's what a collaboration is. He treats you like a collaborator. He'll always say, let's give it a shot. And if that works, cool. And if it doesn't, let's go back and do what we planned, his outline. So there's a couple books we did where that happened. One of them, he to this day says it's one of the best books he's ever produced. And it came up with an idea midway through, and I said, "Why don't we do this?" And he was a little skeptical, but he said, "Try it. Let's just take a few steps at a time. Show me what you're thinking, and if we like it, great." And we just proceeded from there. So he's like, it's crazy because he could be a jerk. He'd be entitled to be a jerk with all his success, but he's the farthest thing from it. He's so chill. He's so laid back. He's not laid back about the content. He wants it the way he wants it, but he's so chill in how he presents it. He never makes you feel like you let him down, even though I know I have. He never yells. He's just a pleasure to work with.
And now your latest solo book, The Best Lies, that came out on July 24th.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about that? Just not give too much of the plot away, but I really enjoyed it, and we'll talk about that later about your characters because you know you hear your main character here is a diagnosed pathological liar, and that's just fascinating to me. So can you tell us a little bit about it and then how you came up with those characters and the flaws?
Yeah, I mean, I have learned, I've been writing my own books for a long time. I took a break. That's a whole story in itself. I took about 6 or 8 years and didn't produce my own work because I was a judge. I still am a judge, and I was writing with Patterson. My kids were young, and I got into a little bit of a fight with my publisher. And so when I started back writing my own solo books, I wrote Look Closer a couple years ago, and then I've now written The Best Lies. And, you know, that time away gave me some time to reflect on what I did best and, what I was good at and what I should emphasize. And I had a lot of help from my wife, who's very smart, even though she doesn't really read this genre. She knows me. And she said to me one time, you are at your best when you start with a character that really intrigues you. And there's this age-old debate, Alan. I'm sure you've heard it. You probably participated in it, where you say, what's more important, the plot or the character? And I used to answer that by saying it was a false dichotomy, that they're both equally important. And I still kind of think that. I still think the plot is exceptionally important. But I think that by a vote of maybe 55 to 45, I would pick character over plot. And I do that because I think that if you are really intrigued by a character, you want to follow them wherever they go. And hopefully, no author is going to be dumb enough to take you into the waiting room at the DMV while they get their license renewed, right? You're going to put them in situations that are interesting. But if the character is interesting, almost anything about them and what they do is interesting. And if you just have a wooden character who's doing all these kind of cool plot things, there's helicopters exploding and they're engaged in gunfights, things I don't really do very much of. But if they're that's all happening in the context of a character you don't really feel connected to, it feels a little wooden to me. So I always start with the character now. And so I said to myself, what do I want to do for my next book? Look Closer was very successful. I've been actually blown away by how successful, and it kind of put me back on a big map. And it was a little intimidating. What do I do next? And again, start with character. And I really got intrigued with the idea of beginning with a protagonist who's a pathological liar, because I write books about, psychological thrillers and deceptions in every book I write. And I thought, what if I start with a character who is deceptive, maybe even to the reader? And that really grabbed me. And then I said, okay, now let's build the background of this character. And in my books, I find my character background becomes the plot. It becomes a lot of the plot. What made this person who he is today has something to do with what's going to happen to him in the book. And so I thought, why would this guy, his name is Leo, why would Leo be a pathological liar? And I came up with a pretty crazy backstory for why that I thought worked really well. And he's a very neurotic person. He's very neurotic about numbers, for example. And I thought that was kind of interesting and fun to watch him be neurotic about numbers. But at the same time, there's a character reason why he likes numbers. So it all kind of fit together. So I started there and I thought, what could I best do with a pathological liar? And then I just got intrigued about this idea of a lawyer who it has such an oversized sense of fairness that he will stop at nothing to right a wrong. And that's Leo. He's a criminal defense lawyer who sometimes in the justice system sees a real wrong, and he'll stop at nothing to fix it, even if it comes at great personal expense to him. And so that's kind of how the book begins. It begins with him. I'm giving nothing away because it's in the first chapter. He's arrested for murder of a very, very, very bad person. Um, and he very quickly finds himself caught in the middle of an undercover FBI operation. And so I thought, yeah, a pathological liar caught in the middle of an undercover FBI operation where he has to satisfy the FBI to get out of his criminal problems. And he's dealing with a very bad guy, the boss of the person who was murdered. And I thought, I put a bunch of smart people together with a smart pathological liar in the middle. What can I do with that? And the possibilities were endless. And so that's really what the book is about. It's a murder mystery. It's also just an intellectual and psychological thriller of how this guy manages or doesn't manage to extricate himself from a very difficult situation.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing with your books too, especially being that you're an attorney and a judge. Uh, and like we're talking before about James Patterson about writing something that's entertaining, but yet you're still the legal system better than anybody. How do you balance that? Like you want to be accurate, but you don't, like you said, you don't want to bore people at the DMV. Is that like something you think about when you're planning this and when you're writing these?
I think about that every second of every moment that I'm writing, which is not all day. I only write in the mornings because I Once it hits like 7 o'clock, I have to be a judge. But yeah, no, you constantly think about those things. And there's that old phrase you've probably heard, killing your babies. You might have something really interesting to say about the law, and you really enjoy talking about it because you're me and you like talking about the law. It's what I do for a living. And you suddenly think, wait a second, I just spent three-quarters of a page talking about the Fourth Amendment. And maybe people don't care that much about the Fourth Amendment. Maybe they care a little bit because they do a little bit. Like people like insights. If you have expert knowledge, they want to know it, but they don't want you to bore them to tears. It's just a constant balance where you try to show them some interesting stuff, but keep it moving. That's what Patterson would say. Keep it moving. That's interesting. Say it. Tell us a little something. Hey, that's cool. But then move on. Move on to what you're doing in that chapter. You're doing the character, you're doing the plot, what have you. So yeah, you are constantly thinking about that.
Hmm. And kind of curious about your writing process too now. So I'm assuming because you worked so much with James Patterson, do you outline your solo books too, or?
I wish that I could. Jim has a talent that I have not been able to figure out, which is the ability to see the entire thing from the beginning. My books, as you probably know, are incredibly twisty. I analogize them to watching say an 8 episode show on Netflix or Amazon Prime, a thriller where at the end of every episode there's some cliffhanger or twist that makes you want to keep going. That's basically what I do. If I write an 80,000 word book, about every 10,000 words, I'm going to try to give you a twist that you did not see coming. So I'm constantly keeping you guessing, not in an exhausting way. You can do that too much. I don't do it too much, but enough that, there's like every, episode of the show, every 10,000 words, you're like, oh my God, what's going to happen next? That's mostly what I'm aiming for to do because I think that's fun because that's what I want to read. And by the way, I think I've actually forgotten the question you even asked me because I tend to ramble like this. I apologize. But that's really what I'm shooting to do is to, I write the word fun on a post-it and I stick it to my computer, the same one I'm talking to you on now. And every chapter has to be fun. That's what Patterson says. Every chapter has to be entertaining in some way. Fun might be a bit of an overstatement. Some chapters aren't fun. They're scary or they're heartbreaking even, but there's something, there's some exclamation point in each chapter. And so you make every chapter count. And for me, you throw in a twist every, 8 or 10 chapters to keep everyone guessing.
Hmm. And is it when you go back to writing like with an outline, does that like throw you off, or does you?
Oh yeah, that was your question. So Alan, if I could outline that whole thing, I would. Because if I could do that, I could write the book in 6 months. But my brain doesn't work that way. I have some ideas when I start. I often know there's often going to be a fairly big twist at the end, like there was in The Best Lies. Like I knew that twist all along. That was one of the first things I thought of. It was, and I won't give it away. I won't even reference it. It was just something I'd been thinking about for a long time. And I thought that would be really cool to do in a book. And I thought this is the perfect book to do it. Did I think of every twist in the middle? No. I have a general idea of what's going to happen in the plot. And I try and I sit there. In fact, I'm doing that right now in my next book, right? I haven't written very much of it yet, but I'm trying to foresee the plot twists. I just can't. What happens to me is as I start writing, I get invested in the characters, and then I start thinking, oh, now that I'm getting to know them better and thinking what they may or may not do, hey, how about this? What if this were true instead? Now, sometimes, Alan, that will happen on page 175 of my book, which means pages 1 through 174 are now going to have to be changed, right, to fit my new idea. And so that's inefficient. I freely admit I am an inefficient writer, but that's how I do it. That's how I roll. And I don't see that changing. And so I've just got to kind of embrace that. It's hard to start a book not knowing everything you're going to do. It's scary because you could waste a lot of your time writing something and then saying, oh, wait, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this instead. And now I just spent 6 weeks writing stuff I'm not going to use. That happens to me sometimes. But you have to embrace that if you're me, because that's the only way I know how to do it. And so far, it seems people are pretty happy with the work product. And so something is working. I'm just not writing as fast as I could. So
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's working for you, and you're producing some great books. So that, if
Thanks.
if it isn't broken, don't fix it.
I'm trying. I'm trying.
I was also curious too, because like you said, you're an active judge, so like, that's your
Yeah,
day job,
yeah,
and
yeah.
a successful author. So I was kind of curious, do you being a sitting judge, do you have to like get permission? Do they know, or just kind of curious how that works?
No, no, there's no rule that says I can't write books.
Okay.
And for the record, I do it between the hours of 3:30 a.m. to 7 a.m. So I
Oh,
don't do it during working hours. And sometimes on the weekends, but frankly, the weekends usually end up being gobbled up by my family. My family basically starts waking up. My wife and my three kids start to get ready for school and work around 7. So that's when I stop. And then it's time to get ready myself and then put on the robe, so to speak, and be a judge. And so the good news for me is I'm on the Court of Appeals, so I write opinions. I don't hear cases every day like a trial judge would. I don't, criminal cases don't, where you are convicted or acquitted. I don't try those cases. I don't preside. I get the appeals out of Chicago of all criminal and civil. So it's all in writing. It's all a written job. We might argue with the lawyers. I might argue on Zoom with the lawyers, like I'm talking to you on Zoom right now. I'll just have a different background. I think I showed it to you. I have a courtroom background. Um, but it makes it easier to manage your time because I'm less beholden to schedules. There's less, oh, I've got a bunch of hearings today in front of a bunch of different lawyers and parties. I don't have those. I get the appeals. It's all in writing. And so I can control my schedule more. But no, by and large, I work from 8 to 5 at least, and sometimes if I've got a big case that needs to get done, I'll work on it at night or on the weekends. But it works. It's worked so far. It's hard. I'm not getting enough sleep and I'm getting older, so it's tough. But so far, I've been able to keep it up.
yeah. So the Best Lies that came out on July 24th, and you said you're working on a new one, and I saw that you also have another book with James Patterson coming out. I think it's your 10th one, and on September 30th, Lies He Told Me.
Yeah.
And that's available for pre-order now, by the way. So for the listeners who want to go pick that up,
Yeah,
uh,
that's a really fun book that Jim and I did together, The Lies He Told Me. And we changed the title a few times, and nobody asked me about the titles. Jim makes those decisions. And it's funny, I've got The Best Lies and then The Lies He Told Me coming out within like 5 months or 3 months of each other. And 2 months of each other actually. So it's kind of funny, but that's the kind of stuff I write about. Like I like writing about ordinary people. You can do the supernatural. You can have someone like Superman who bullets bounce off him. Like that does not interest me. And you can have a nearly superhuman person like a Jack Reacher. Like I love Jack Reacher books, and Lee Child, who created those, is a someone I used to know pretty well, and he's phenomenal. But that's not what I write. Like I'm going to write about normal people who, in ordinary situations, would not transgress these boundaries we set for ourselves. They wouldn't kill somebody. They wouldn't create these fabric of lies, but they're pushed to do it by extreme circumstances. And I think people relate to that because I think most of us are like that. I mean, I know I am. I'm a pretty humdrum guy in my daily life, right? And I always have been. I was a good student in high school. I followed all the rules. I went to college, then law school, became a lawyer in a big law firm. I've really, by all conventional standards, I followed all the rules and done all the right things, right? I didn't break the law. I don't do anything crazy, but I was always more fascinated by the people who broke the law and broke the rules at least. Excuse me. And I think we find those people interesting because we're all just a few steps from that.
mhm.
Oh, to just cross that line and do something that you wouldn't dream of doing. Excuse me.
Yeah, no problem. I can cut that out, so don't worry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I find interesting. People push to do things they wouldn't ordinarily do. I think people can relate to that because we're all basically ordinary people.
Hmm. And you got such an insight on that because you actually see that. I mean, in your as a judge, you've seen people at their worst and probably normal people who's something happened. And so that's do you ever draw from that from your judge experience, put them into your books or?
Well, I've never specifically drawn from a real case. I've been inspired by cases. I've gotten ideas from cases. Certainly the legal side of it. the technology, when you talk about DNA, the ability to track people by cell phones, that's a lot of stuff I learned on the job. But in terms of the people, you're right. I do see a lot of people who've done bad things, but who are not necessarily bad people. There's an element of tragedy to every criminal case I see. There's a victim, but there's also a perpetrator who also is in some ways usually a victim too. And I think that's interesting to people. And most people don't look under the hood and see that. They'll hear about a murder and they'll say, oh, that's a bad guy. Well, that's a punishable offense and that person should be punished. The person isn't necessarily a bad guy. And if they are a bad guy, there is probably a reason why they become a bad guy. I don't really believe in that. I don't believe in calling someone a bad guy. But if it's someone who serially commits crime, there's something that happened to them that made them that way. I don't think it's genetic. It's usually spawned by their circumstances. And as you can imagine, you see a lot of very tough circumstances for these people. And so there's an element of tragedy in all of it. But it's also interesting because you can dig into the characters of these people in the books and bring them to life and make it real for people, for the reader.
And then I always ask my guests because I do have aspiring writers that listen to this podcast. What do you use to write? Is this just like Microsoft Word or something different?
Yeah. I just use Microsoft Word. My word processing is very basic. I have a cloud that saves it automatically, so if God forbid something happened, I could somehow manage to recover it. But yeah, I don't do anything special, and I just work on this laptop that I beat to death for like 3 years and then get another one. Um, yeah, no, it's nothing. It's just I like to keep it simple. I have a pretty simple workstation. I'll play music when I write a lot of the time. One of the reasons that I like to listen to music when I write, there's two big reasons. One is that if that is somehow slightly distracting me, it makes me less likely to be distracted by other things like the internet or my email. Um, it makes me go off into a world versus sitting there just completely silently writing. Then I'm going to become aware of things and I'll hear a little beep on my computer about a email I got, or I'll go on the internet and search for something. The other reason I like music is it sets a mood for me. The same way it sets a mood in movies. When you watch a movie, if something scary is happening, you hear scary music. If it's something romantic, you hear that kind of music. I will sometimes tailor the music to what I'm writing. And if I'm writing something really scary, I'll put on some haunting music just to kind of get me in the mood. And if I'm writing something funny, which I try to have some humor in my books, I try to have a good amount of humor in my books, at least sarcasm. Um, then it may be something more lighthearted that I'm listening to. So um, I do recommend that. I recommend for readers find the music that works for you. Some people can't listen to lyrics, so they just play like music. And sometimes I listen to cello music, or violin. My daughter plays the violin, my son plays the cello. And of course there's no lyrics in that, but it can be very moving music. So whatever floats your boat. If rap music is what you need, listen to rap music. But I do recommend music as a way to help you concentrate, ironically.
And then the last question before I let you go, especially with your background and you have a very busy job and a family. So advice for aspiring writers who maybe don't think they have enough time to write. Can you give us some advice for that?
Well, first of all, you have to make it a priority. When I wrote my first book, I was working at a downtown Chicago law firm where I worked till 10 o'clock every night. So I just made a deal with myself that I would spend at least 1 hour a night devoted to writing. And sometimes that would be from 11:30 at night till half past midnight. But I would do it, and I stuck to it for 3 years and wrote my first book. You have to have that discipline. If you don't have that discipline, I guarantee you there's going to be a million reasons not to work on your book that day, especially if you're new, if you don't have a book contract, if you don't have a name, you don't have, expectations of you. If you're just writing as an unknown person like I did, you have to make yourself do it. And if it's that much of a chore, you probably shouldn't be doing it. Like it was, I viewed it as a labor of love. Like it was exciting for me every night after being a lawyer all day to get to play make believe. And sometimes that hour would be 2 or 3 hours because I was having so much fun. In fact, that would often happen. My 1 hour could be more than that. But whatever you need to do, you do have to make it a priority. In the meantime, I would say read good literature that inspires you. probably in the genre you want to write in. But even if not, even if it's not the genre, good writing can inspire you. For me personally, good music will inspire me. Good movies and TV. TV and movies are kind of blurring together now, right? Nowadays. That will inspire me. Like great art inspires me to, I want to be that good. You know, I want to do that in my books, what you did on screen. Um, be around art that inspires you, preferably reading. And the last thing I would say is writing is a muscle. You can take all the classes you want. I didn't take classes. I taught myself how to write. And what I did was I wrote initially and said that's not good enough. Like I had the one talent I had, Alan, was the ability to recognize that my work sucked at the beginning. I don't know how else to say it. It just wasn't that good. I read it after I wrote it and said, I wouldn't want to read this. This isn't good enough yet. Let's make it better. And then I rewrote it and rewrote it. It's just like lifting weights. I just got muscles and I started learning it and saying, okay, this is how you do it. You can teach yourself to write as long as either you have the ability to recognize bad writing of your own or you have someone you trust who will tell you. Because you're not doing yourself any good if you're not writing well. And you may not write well right away. Not everybody has that talent off the bat, but that's okay. You don't have to. You can teach yourself how to do it the right way. You just have to keep writing and keep working at it.
All right, that's great advice. Thank you so much, David, for coming on the podcast. Really had a great time talking with you.
Thanks. Time flew. Thank you, Alan. Anytime. I'd love to come back.
Yeah, absolutely.